And it has felt a little bit at times this afternoon like a reunion of former BBC employees in this afternoon's debate. And there have been certain complaints about BBC journalism as well during the course of the afternoon. I thought at one point we were going to get the accusation that they were responsible for turning off the sound system and stopping our comments being broadcast to the nation via the dozens of people following us on BBC Parliament channel as we speak. But or perhaps not dozens, but anyway, as many honourable members have said, transparency is extremely important, and I suppose, since I know the honourable member for East Londonderry is digging very deep on this particular issue, reveal my own interest in this matter, which is in the Declaration of Members' Interest, Mr. Bone, which is the payments that I have received over the last year or so in my work as a musician from the TV channel Dave, which in turn is owned by UK TV, which in turn is owned 50% by the BBC as part of its attempts to raise money from other sources other than the licence fee, which of course it does in quite considerably greater amounts than it did originally. Can I congratulate him on securing the debate? He raised a lot of issues which I know he feels very strongly about in relation to BBC journalism, and in particular the coverage of the issue that did, as my honourable friend pointed out, bring down the administration in Northern Ireland, and we all hope it'll be up and running again soon. And he raised points about transparency in salary and about declarations of interest and other matters, and about the kind of vague answers he got to his questions from the BBC. And I would appeal to the BBC, and I'm going to go on to say why I think I'm going to make some very positive remarks about the BBC as well, but I would say that I think it's better to give clarity in answers to members of Parliament about issues. I think they should be directed via the management, by the way, but I think it's better to give clarity about these issues rather than to give the sort of vague answers that are routinely given by the government in response to parliamentary questions. I'd much rather that they would directly answer questions, because a lot of the answers he gave from the BBC sounded very much like the sorts of answers I get when I put down parliamentary questions. I don't know if other honourable members have had that experience, but I certainly have had when we put down questions to the government, necessitating further questions and freedom of information inquiries and so on. Now, the honourable lady for Eastleigh also spoke very well, as always, in the debate, and said that rather like being in government, the BBC sometimes didn't know what the left hand and the right hand were doing. But I think she quite rightly explained the importance of the BBC ensuring pay equality. And one thing that has really come out in relation to the recent publication of the salaries of BBC staff is that issue of gender inequality and indeed other forms of inequality. And it is absolutely right that that should be published, it should be transparent, and that the BBC should take urgent steps to address it, as indeed should other broadcasters who aren't subject to freedom of information or to have to make an annual report to Parliament in the way that the BBC does. And they should all be, even in the private sector too, should all be looking at making sure that gender equality in pay and other forms of equality are being followed in the matters of pay and personnel. The honourable member for Keighley is someone that I've known for 37 years, I think, and he's been top talent himself all of that time, and he told us, he made a very, very good point, I thought, about the exposure that very high-profile BBC presenters get, and the fact that that has a huge value beyond the salary that they are paid. And indeed, I think I completely agree with him on that point. And he also, quite rightly, pointed out the difficult job in Northern Ireland journalists have had to do, and that we should remember that at all times. The Honourable Lady for Taunton, I think, told us that she couldn't reveal her age to us today, despite it being a debate about transparency. But what she did go on to say, which is why I did intervene on it, was I think we should be careful about the language you use about government holding to account the BBC. I think it's worth us reminding ourselves that the BBC is an independent organisation established by a royal charter, and that it's independent. And if we think for a moment, you know, it is vital that it isn't the government's role ultimately to hold the BBC to account, for example, for its journalism, and impartiality, because the government is extremely partial itself. And it's a very dangerous thing in countries where that happens, where the state broadcaster, in effect, is controlled by the government. That we know the implications of that in countries like Russia and elsewhere. So what we want to have is a publicly funded, transparent BBC that is accountable. And the proper way it's accountable to us as politicians is via Parliament, and via the Select Committee, which is very ably chaired by a member of her own party, and a number of my honourable friends are members of it too. And then through an independent regulator, as my honourable friend quite rightly pointed out for Keighley, whose job it is to make sure it is fulfilling its role under the Charter, which is then negotiated and in line with government, in partnership, which sets out that broad scope. So that's the point I was making. I think that's a really, really important fundamental principle that we shouldn't lose sight of.
Didn't express it well enough. But the point I was making was that clearly that wasn't working quite well enough. Hence, the government did have to step in to require more transparency, and that is now having effect.
We don't have time to rehearse exactly what happened and how all this came about here. But I make my point, and I want to make it with force on that particular point. The Honourable Lady for North Ayrshire and Arran said something which also concerned me in the course of the debate. She said about the perception of whether the BBC's reporting was biased or not. She actually said, and I think I quote her accurately, and I'm sure she'll tell me if I don't, it doesn't really matter whether it's true or not, whether its reporting is fair and unbiased. All that matters is the perception. In other words, it's not about fake news, it's about false perception. And if that's what she's saying, fine. But she seemed to be saying and implying, perhaps, that the perception is right, and that the BBC does not report impartially on politics in Scotland. I will give way.
Just for the point of clarification, what I would like to say to the honourable gentleman is that the point is it's a problem if your paying customers don't have any faith in the way that you reflect their reality.
And of course, the Honourable Lady provided no evidence that that is the case during the course of her remarks. And surveys of public perception, I haven't got time to give way, but surveys of public perception suggest the exact opposite over time, if you look at it in relation to perceptions of impartiality by the BBC. And it's important we stand up to the Donald Trump-like approach to media when it comes on the reporting of the news. I will also, my honourable friend, the member for Ellesmere Port and Neston, I thought made some very fair and responsible points about the importance of transparency and accountability. Now, time is very short, Mr Bone, and there's so much more that one could say, and I'm sure the Minister will say some of the things, even on this occasion, we might even agree on a few things in relation to the BBC, much as it would pain him to admit that that is true. But what I want to say is make this general point about the BBC, and that is that we all have our criticisms of it. We've all been victims of its vigorous journalism from time to time. They once named me on Panorama for accepting hospitality in an event which they'd invited me to. And when I pointed that out to them, that the right hand literally didn't know what the left hand was doing within the organisation, I felt the pain of other honourable members of being, taken to task in my role from time to time. But they're going to make mistakes and they're going to do things. But I think it is important that we remember that the BBC is still genuinely envied and admired and has a huge reputation across the world. And in the words of Joni Mitchell from Big Yellow Taxi, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. We should, in our quite appropriate debate about the level of transparency that is absolutely necessary for the BBC and the accountability it should have as a publicly funded organisation, let's not lose sight of what is an extraordinary British institution.